Okay, so let's get started this morning. Thank you very much for everyone that's joining us here today. We have an excellent presentation, Journey Towards Reconciliation as an Engineer, and by Freda Leong, and she's with Associated Engineering. I'm Jason Lueke. I'm the current chair of the Education Outreach Committee for CUIC, and also the National Discipline Lead for Trenchless at Associated Engineering, and today I'll be your moderator here for today. So this is one of the seminars or webinars we've been doing as part of CUIC. We've done quite a few this year. This is the second last one and we have one more before the end of the year. And then we've already started planning. We got 12 really interesting topics coming up next year. And you'll see some of that information coming out here shortly. These are complimentary webinars. The ones going in the future will be the same. As you can see, the full schedule for this year, there's one more, but next year they'll be coming out online and you'll be seeing more advertisements here very soon. So CUIC is a cross-Canada hub for research and education and underground infrastructure. We started up back earlier this year, centered out of the University of Alberta, but it's a Canada-wide focus. And just recently, some success stories. We put together a research grant, and that's out there right now, and just waiting to hear back. But the center focuses on the research and education and the outreach to professionals in the infrastructure that are related to underground infrastructure. So it's a membership based, involves stakeholders including municipalities, contractors, and owners. And we're trying to identify those issues which are pressing to underground infrastructure. So we're talking about a variety of sectors here, and we're talking about water, transportation, wastewater, gas distribution, electricity, power, telecommunications, anything to do with underground construction. And all these sectors do face very similar challenges related to construction maintenance of underground infrastructure, and that's what CUIC attempts to bring to the surface and allow everybody to share. Membership is open to anybody. So manufacturers, suppliers, contractors, consultants, utilities, not-for-profits. You become an official research partner with the University of Alberta and gives access to CUIC Connect and other benefits as a member. So that'll be there'll be some more information coming out here later this year and next year. All right, so today, Freda Leong, she's a manager for Indigenous infrastructure with Associated Engineering. She works out of our Vancouver office. She has over 25 years of experience in the planning, management, assessment, and design of water, sanitary sewer, water, and wastewater treatment, roads, drainage assets, community buildings, subdivision, and site servicing projects. She's been working with Indigenous communities since 2005. Freda, she's very passionate about what she does, and I think she believes the success of what she does and brings is related to those strong working relationships she has with her Indigenous communities, and she understands the importance of clear, open, honest communication, and all that leads to positive outcomes in not only in terms of the projects but in relationships and long-term relationships. She was involved in the Kluskas Village domestic water system improvements, and it won a ACECBC 2002 Award of Excellence for projects under 2.5 million. And she's currently assisting the EGBC in the development of their regulatory learning module related to truth and reconciliation. So welcome, Freda. Before we get started, if there's any questions or comments, please put those questions in the Q&A tab at the bottom, and we'll get to those at the end. Presentation will be about 25 minutes, half hour, and then Freda will stick around, and we can have some discussion or dialogue afterwards. So anyways, welcome, Freda, and let's see. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for joining me today. I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. I'm on the unceded territory of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and the Musqueam. I acknowledge all the Indigenous people who have cared for these lands since time immemorial, and make this acknowledgement as an act of reconciliation and gratitude to those whose territory I reside and work on. So the presentation overview, I'm going to be talking about Indigenous Relations 101, my project experience, and reconciliation for engineering projects. So Indigenous Relations 101, I think it's important to start with some terminology. In this day and age, I think we've been hearing a lot about Aboriginal peoples, and we hear Indigenous, Métis, and Inuit. So as an overall, I generally use the term Indigenous because it covers status and non-status First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. Métis people are people of European Indigenous ancestry, and Inuit are generally in the northern regions of Canada. So when we think of the territories, we think of more of the Inuit. But by saying Indigenous, we cover all three groups and it makes it a little bit easier. But I think one thing to always remember is always defer to your communities, ask them what they're comfortable with and what terminology they would like to be used. And there's also the Indian Act, which is talked about a lot. So the Act pretty much governs how the government deals with the Indigenous peoples of Canada. And when we talk about the Indian Act, what we'll hear a lot about also is band members. A band member is an individual Indian who's recognized as member of the band. And what you'll hear sometimes also is people will say, well, I've become a band member of, say, Lower Similkameen Indian Band. You can become a band member, but you might not necessarily be a status or registered Indian. So it could be that the band or the Indigenous nation recognizes you as a band member, but it doesn't mean that the government of Canada recognizes you as a band member. And so band council is another term that we hear a lot about, and that's a band council is the elected council. And so that would be the chief counselor and any other counselor representatives. And so with some of our communities, what you'll see is that you'll have, if there's a lot of larger family groups in the community, they might have representatives from each family that are part of the band council. So a status or registered Indian is somebody who's recognized under the Indian Act and has all the rights and title that comes with being covered under the Indian Act. So non-status is somebody who's not recognized under the Indian Act. And Aboriginal rights are rights and legal rights to lands and entitlements that Indigenous people have, which falls underneath the Indian Act. And Aboriginal people have rights because of their long-standing relationship with the land and the use of the land. So one great book that's out there, and I'm sure you guys have heard about it, is a book by Bob Joseph that talks about the 21 things you didn't know about the Indian Act. And I'm going to go through it briefly here, and I'm not going to go into great detail, but some of the things that I think are really important for us to realize and how it plays into the communities that we are engaging with and working in are sort of some key points here are like the introduction of residential schools. When we think about residential schools, a lot of people think that they ended like a long time ago. But when you think about it, in all reality, they ended in 1997. And that's a very recent history. It's not something I would say that is a long time ago. There's junior engineers that were born that year, right? So there's people that we know of within our families or within our age group, which would fall under that deadline of when these residential schools ended. And we've heard enough about the residential schools to realize the harm and the effects they've had on not just the children, but their successive generations that were impacted by it. And then what you'll also see is that another really important thing is that they took away lands from Indigenous communities, that they could take it off if they felt like, if a municipality or felt like a part of a reserve wasn't being used to its full potential, it could be appropriated for reserve roads, for railways, for other public works. And that's why you'll see a lot of these reserves that were initially signed as part of a treaty that were slowly shrunken and shrunken because they were taken back because they weren't being used for, if they said it was meant for farming or agriculture, they would take it away. You'd see that, oh, well, they're not using that land, so we'll use it for like around a lot of lakes and things like that. They took it away for cottage homes. You'll see, especially in Ontario and things that we heard about Oka, they use it for golf. Like a lot of land was taken away without anybody really batting an eye or really looking to see, well, is this really fair? And now that's why we have a lot of land claims going on. And that was that big thing about uncultivated reserve lands. If they weren't using it for farming, then they would take it away from them. They forbade First Nations from forming political organizations, which is a huge thing. And then they also, one thing that was really important is they also stopped them from speaking their native language. They imposed, like I said, that band council system. And so what we hear about on the news a lot of times right now is you'll hear about hereditary chiefs, you'll hear about elected chiefs, and why there's such a big issue is that we've sort of imposed this band council because we've said that the only thing we recognize is an elected council because we're a democracy. But my understanding is that we didn't really elect King Charles. I think that's hereditary. So it's sort of interesting that we've sort of imposed a system that is meant to be electoral, but we still, in some instances, we accept hereditary chiefs or heads of state. They stop them from practicing their religion. And one thing when I talk about this native language piece is I've worked with a bunch of communities now where they're saying they're at the precipice of losing their language. And being Indigenous and having a lot of their history being passed on through oral history, it means that a lot of their history is being lost. And the other thing is what I've started to realize is when you talk about the loss of language, it's a loss of history. It's also a loss of culture because I know how to speak because I'm a Chinese speaking person. I can speak Chinese and I don't have an issue with speaking Chinese because I've always heard it from a very early age. And for me to be able to communicate in Chinese is not tough. But if somebody is learning the language secondhand as an like a Chinese language learner, they're always going to have an accent. They're going to have issues saying words because they're not used to hearing it and not used to actually mimicking it and making the same sounds. And so what's happened is that there's specific language that's used for ceremony, for potlatches and things like that. But if it's not being passed on and it can't be passed on, then we're losing a lot of that tradition and all that connection to culture. And then the other thing is the Indian Act also denied First Nations the right to vote, and it was repealed on March 31st, 1960. So prior to 1960, Indigenous people had no say in what was being done for them or in their favor, supposedly. And so that is interesting that they were not considered Canadian citizens until 1960. And then the biggest thing is it created a British rule for the purpose of subjugating one race, the Aboriginal peoples. Why is understanding Indigenous history important? I think it's important because we have to understand the context in terms of why are we work in if the people who have worked in communities, they've realized there's a capacity issue. We have a brain drain from a lot of our communities. There is we have a hard time getting our communities to engage. And we keep on thinking that sometimes, oh, well, this project isn't important to them. It's obvious that they have a lot of things on their plate. But what we've got to realize is how the system has been set up is that they're very small clusters of communities who have a small administration, who have a hard time keeping a larger administration because there's only so much funding available. And at the same time, that means that they have a skeleton crew of administration to run capital projects, and everybody's running at least 4 to 5 programs. And so that impacts how they're able to run their capital projects or even to start a capital project. And I think the other thing is there's a huge disconnect when it comes to us wanting to help communities. I think if we understand the history of Indigenous communities better, then we would start wanting to listen versus trying to come in with the best ideas. As engineers and as practitioners of technical projects, I think our biggest issue is that we know what we know best, but we are not very good at stepping back and listening to our communities and listening to what they know best. We have to design for our clients and not for ourselves. We can't be designing projects that we know have worked in this community, but we're not listening to this community because they know what's best for them and what will work best for them. And I base this on the projects that I've worked on with Indigenous communities. And it's very interesting how we believe that we know best, but it's very hard for us to step back. And I don't think it's ever because we want to be domineering, but it's because we think that we're saving time and that we're giving them the maximum benefit. So my projects in general, I've only highlighting 3, but this is the Cluscus domestic water system. So Cluscus domestic, they started looking at getting upgrades to their water system probably around 20, 25 years ago. So they wrote to the federal government and told them, we've been on a boil water advisory. We can't drink our water. It's not safe for our community. And it was a real issue for the elders and for the community members, because what happens with Cluscus is that the only water they get, drinking water they get in, is actually brought in water bottles from Quesnel, which is on a good day, probably a 2.5-hour drive. On a bad day, it could be up to 4 to 5 hours each way just to deliver the water. So they have not had tap water, drinking tap water, for over 25 years. And so what happened is there's a series of consulting firms that came in. First, they gave them some creek water and there wasn't enough treatment. So there was some issues with that and there wasn't enough supply. And that was the bigger issue, that we could do the treatment, but there wouldn't be enough long-term sustainable yield from the creek source because it's seasonal. We're going to have times where it's going to be, there's not enough water to supply to the community. And then they came up with another water source. They drilled some wells and the consultants came to community, but they actually didn't speak to anyone. And they drilled some wells next to their old burial grounds. And because of that, community members didn't want to drink the water. It didn't show in the water quality that there was any nitrates or anything that was showing up that would show there's any leaching from the traditional burial grounds. But the fact was, nobody spoke to anyone in community when they drilled those wells. And yet again, it goes back to that not listening thing. If they had just spent the day with the community or with the elders, they would have figured out that that isn't the place. Maybe we should site the wells somewhere else where people would feel comfortable drinking the water. And we started working with the community in around 2015, looking at alternate water sources. They wanted to look at surface water sources because they didn't trust wells based on their experience with the other consultant and drilling in the burial grounds. In their mind, wells weren't safe. We looked at alternate surface water sources, and those didn't work out because we didn't have that long-term sustainable yield that would be required. But in the end, we worked with the community and we found some wells that were on the other side of the creek that would give us the long-term sustainable yield and the water quality that we needed. And I think the biggest success was the communication. It wasn't because we were technically better, and I don't think it's ever really the case for small communities. It's because we actually spent the time with the community and we actually reached out. We were always welcomed with open arms. We had the best team. The elders were so welcoming. And that's what I remember most. Like, it's about the connections that you make and the trust that you build. And they trust this water and they're drinking this water because they were involved from inception, not just from, as an afterthought, this is what we're putting in, but actually from, hey, what do you think is the problem here? Why are you concerned? What are you concerned about? And spending time with them and really listening and making sure that we engaged. The next project is Arviat. This is up in Nunavut. It's not easy to get there, that's for sure. And so this water treatment plant, again, is probably around 5 years old. And we were having issues with removing organics and also turbidity issues. And so with this system, the biggest issue, yet again, is not that the technology was wrong, is that we weren't listening to what the issues at hand were, which was O&M. If you put in a system in the community that's up in Nunavut that requires a lot of O&M, you're going to be in trouble. We do not have operators, we have maintainers. They have truck fill systems. They're running these trucks all day to fill the cisterns at the houses. And so they don't have time to spend at the plant. So they put in a system that sort of works, but is not meeting the turbidity requirements because they looked at some seasonal water quality data that wasn't indicative of what happens full year. And so what we end up having to do is put in cartridge filters at the very end of the system to do some final polishing before they do the truck fills. And it goes into the reservoir and then does the truck fills. So what we have is we have to replace like 12 cartridge filters every day. This is heaped on top of all the truck fills, of everything else. And it comes down to not thinking about what the capacity of that community is in terms of the failure in what was proposed. And so we're looking at doing a feasibility to do some updates, to do some pre-treatment and hopefully cut down on what they need to do at the tail end so that we don't have to spend more time doing more maintainer roles than they have time for. And then finally, Kitsum-Kalem Community Hall. So we have a beautiful community hall that is on its last legs. And what we're doing here is actually looking and engaging with the community, and not just one community group, but a variety of community groups to see what they see as being needs for the community hall. And a big part of it, yet again, is the engagement piece. A lot of how this building works right now, it works based on how the previous architect thought the building should work versus how the community would like it to work. And as part of our community upgrades, what we're hoping to do is to put in improvements that answer to their needs and gets it so that they're better able to serve the needs of the community, especially when it comes to child and family services, running programs, running cultural programming, running teaching and elders, engaging with elders so that we can get the kids more in tune with culture, learning the language, learning the stories, learning that oral history, and having that start very early in the children's lives. So reconciliation for engineering projects. So call to action 92 is really about what I'm talking about in terms of what I see as being successes and what I hope I'm bringing to projects. It is that we're committing to meaningful consultation and that we're building relationships, that we're not just there because we are ticking a box, but because we really want to engage and we want to learn. It's not just an opportunity for us to pass on knowledge to them. It is also an opportunity for Indigenous peoples to pass on knowledge to us. We have to also look at equitable access to jobs. That means that we're doing training, not just training during the projects, but hopefully something that they can take on and have opportunities to use in the future so that there's career opportunities and not just career opportunities where we benefit as in, okay, we've done the training. This person looks like they're really good. Let's poach them from the community. I don't think that's what we should be doing. I think that's not helping the community, and that adds again to that whole brain drain from communities. and also provide education and management to staff on the history of Aboriginal peoples. And I think that's one thing that all companies should be doing. This is something that we have a lot of implicit biases that we're not even aware that we have. And we have a lot of misunderstandings about the history of Canada. And I think at this point in time, it's easy enough for us to spend some time reading up on it, or if possible, if companies are able to engage a consultant, an Indigenous company that can help come in and help train their people on how to deal with Indigenous communities and how to engage and how to understand the Indigenous communities in their area that they're working in. So what I see as in what we have to change in terms of how we approach technical or engineering projects is very normally it's a client, the engineer, and then the contractor. It's very linear. It's a straight through shot. You know, the client talks to us, we talk to the contractor. There's no real collaboration. It's very one-sided. We're talking this way, we're talking that way, right? But with a reconciliation approach, we're in the circle together. We get to talk to each other. We're all facing in and we're sharing successes, we're sharing failures, we're having difficult conversations, but we're facing each other and having that honest conversation where we get like the operator should be involved. The number of times I've been involved in projects where we come in and the operator goes, "This is the first time anybody's asked us what the issue was," right? And that should not be happening. And there's elders and community members who know about historical. We hire archaeologists, we hire environmental biologists, but we should be talking to community members. We should be asking them what they know about the history. I learned about a landslide risk because there was somebody's great auntie who told them, "Oh yeah, they remembered like so long ago they used to have houses up there. They stopped building them, right? Because there's this landslide risk." And then we realized that we had a whole bunch of clay sitting on bedrock, the and then the geotechnical goes, "Oh yeah, that's like gonna if we have," and they were a high earthquake zone, right? And it could just shake, 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 and just slide into the river. So there's a lot of knowledge there, and we have to actually access that knowledge and be open to accessing that knowledge. And that involves spending time. So how is it different? Like I said, you're getting early buy-in at inception versus at development or at the end where you're just presenting. You're building trust, and trust needs to be there for you to have any honest conversation and for them to provide input that they feel safe in that environment of sharing. And it provides team-based dispute and conflict resolution. So if you're going to have those difficult conversations, we can have them together, right? If somebody's not feeling like they don't understand or they feel like they're not being listened to, they can bring that up in a safe environment. And you invest time, but I think in the end, you also save time because you're having difficult conversations or you're seeing things all with many lenses through many eyes early on and seeing if there is an issue. And decisions are based on a deeper understanding and understanding the community and the community's needs and not just wants. Wants, that's a positive for sure, but we definitely need to look at people's needs and make sure that we're answering to it. And that's based, and you're only going to get it when you get that honesty, and you'll only get it when you have those relationships. And finally, the importance of laughter. If you don't laugh, you're going to cry. And one thing you're going to realize when you're working with your Indigenous communities is that there's always laughter. And even at the harshest of times, there's so much laughter. And I think it means that they trust you. For them to laugh with you and for them to tease you or to share with you or to let their guard down, that means that they trust you. So anytime you're in an Indigenous community and you find that sometimes you're going, "Oh, why are they joking around so much?" or "Why are they teasing me?" Don't take it as a negative. Take it as a positive because you've actually connected on some level and they're sharing with you. So questions?
Excellent. Thank you very much. That was an excellent presentation. So yeah, no, that's good. There's a question came in here, and I got a couple for you. I'll start you off here, and you kind of mentioned here towards the end in terms of laughter. But I know you have a couple examples of projects or where you've kind of built these relationships, and there's some challenging things that have occurred, but in the end, I mean, you have a certain strategy in terms of building these relationships. Can you give an example of maybe of a situation where you turned a negative into a positive and building a really good relationship with a community?
We started working for one community where the first meeting that we had, the chief actually was pretty much telling us off, because he's going, well, you guys come into our community, you're telling us what we need to do. And I've always been saying you guys should be moving this reservoir over to here, but nobody ever listens. And they cited it over there. And now it's next to these homes. And if it goes over, then it's going to crush these homes. But it's because you guys always think you know better and da da da. And then we actually stopped and we're going, we're agreeing with you on this. We want to move that reservoir. And it was like, oh, and he took a step back, because I think he was so used to always having to, thump his fist and talk over you and to really speak up for him to be heard. And he didn't realize that what we wanted to do was, when we had these initial meetings, was to actually get a lot of feedback from them. And that's why we also involved the water operator. So the chief, the water operator, everybody was in that room, and we wanted to have these open conversations and just have people flinging out ideas, thinking about what has worked in the past, what hasn't worked, what do they see as being really important, and what are they scared about, right? And I think that's one thing that it was, and after that, from then on, he would start joking with me more. And initially, actually, he thought I was with Indigenous Services Canada, and he was going, okay, Indian Affairs, you can step down. And then towards the end, he knew that I was Freda and who I was with. And it was nice, because now when he does have issues, he actually calls up and asks me questions, versus that he's like doing the fist thumping and saying, Indigenous Affairs doesn't know what we need. And so that was a real positive.
Nice. We got a question here from an anonymous attendee. If Indigenous communities cannot come to a decision as a group, how do you move forward with the project?
You generally, I think you'll have to, the technical stuff is not what we're asking them to answer on. What we're asking to answer on is more the community welfare and all those other bits and pieces. So in general, what we do is we provide some options. They help develop the options and they provide input, but we haven't really had any instances where people haven't had some form of preference. Right. And so I think if they're engaged early and they know what's going on and the impacts of their decision, they're more likely to come to a consensus. And it might be a mishmash of a few options, but it's rarely that it comes to a stalemate that we can't move forward with.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Another question here from Peter. I'll paraphrase it here a little bit. Have you ever had any experience? The question here is, any challenges with First Nation communities requesting design changes that go against the code, and how to emphasize codes are meant for public safety?
Yes. So sometimes they will, I always say that sometimes the codes are a minimum, not your maximum. And sometimes we might go past those a little bit because we want to ensure the community safe. And I think if you always preface it back to being community health and safety, and you talk about the long-term safety of the community and the long-term needs of the communities, we really haven't had any issues with that either. And I think most of the time, people are against something if they don't fully understand the implications and risks. So if you spend the time to explain the risks in a way that they understand, and it could be sometimes we're using the wrong language where we're not bridging that gap of understanding because we're getting too technical, we make it hard for them to understand why it's important. And so that's that. I think it's not always going to fall back to us, and it's not always going to be the answer, and it won't solve everything, but I would recommend spending more time to explain it and for them to understand the full risks and implications and the long-term needs of the community.
Okay, good. Excellent. Got another question. Any advice on how to adjust expectations for timelines on projects?
Oh,
We
good
are
God.
often schedule driven, but capacity issues or community consensus can take time to resolve.
Yes, that is always going to be a problem. And I used to have this slide that sort of shows like this. First, we're super gung ho and everything's going well and everybody's on the same page. And then we go into the darkness because there's so much funding. Okay, if you work for Indigenous communities, you realize there's a lot of funding submissions that need to be done. And so there's a lot of back and forth with Indigenous affairs. So you're always going to be either working on your project, doing funding submissions, pushing projects through, pushing funding submissions through, submitting this, submitting that. And so it does take time. And the best way I find to do things is setting up review meetings. I used to send out, the documents, like if I'm at 50% review, I'd send it out and I'd go, okay, I'll give you guys 2 weeks to review, give me comments back, review comments after that, right? But it would always drag out. So what I've started doing now is actually adding a 2-hour review meeting. If you are close to community and go out there and present it to community and then get feedback right then and there, fantastic. If you have to do it virtually, it works just as well. But do a review meeting. That actually helps you answer any questions that people have. You explaining it means that they're getting the full, because sometimes we write things and it comes out differently when people read things, right? And so that's an opportunity for you to answer questions as they come up. And so now I cut it down that I'll give them a week to review, which they never really do. But then on the day before, they'll quickly read through it and then we'll do the review meeting. And that usually actually cuts down on that review time. And that's helped move things a lot faster.
Cool. Got a question. I'm not sure if it's a question, maybe more of a comment, I guess, from Bijan. So happy Thanksgiving to our U.S. Attendees today. We're talking about the water, and I'm not sure. Maybe you can comment on this, but there's a lot of issues with potable water in Indigenous communities in Canada, right?
Yeah.
So Bijan's question here is about being thankful for having potable water where he's from, but how can I'm not sure how to phrase this, but maybe what can we do, or what are I think that's probably one of the biggest issues related to Indigenous communities, that access to potable water. How can we solve that, or what can we do, or I'm not sure exactly how to state the question, kind of thing, but
Yeah.
what can we do here?
I think that, there's a lot of flack on the federal government for not doing it. And to some degree, in the past, I can't speak for the past, but I can say that what I'm seeing right now, there is a lot of funding available. But I think as I've worked in communities where we come in to do fix-ups, not necessarily because what was put in is wrong in terms of technology, but what was put in is not the right fit for the community. And I challenge all of us that when we work in Indigenous communities to really spend the time to figure out what capacity they have to operate this system afterwards. Because we spend a lot of time and a lot of effort to look at the capital investment, but we don't spend a lot of time or thought into the aftercare. And that's where we're seeing more failures than we see at the beginning. Technology isn't the kicker, it's the O&M. So we get all the capital investment up front. So if it's a $10 million water treatment plant, ISC will fund it. They'll get 10 million bucks. But when it comes to their O&M funding, it's an archaic, and people that work for Indigenous communities know the Deanne cost reference manual that was developed in 2005 sucked then, and it's sucked even more as the years have gone on. So it sucks severely now. And so for a treatment plant, they get a specified amount that is wholly insufficient. And the thing is, they give you 80% of the wholly insufficient funding. So what you've left behind is a system that, yeah, they paid for all the capital investment, but what they've left behind is none of the O&M investment. So if you provide a system that nobody can operate or they don't have the funds to operate and maintain, then that investment was for naught. And that's where we see a lot of failures. And that's when we come in to do more optimizations. And sometimes we have to change systems out because it doesn't work for that community. It's not that it doesn't work for that water quality. It doesn't work for that community. And that's the challenge we have to take on. Working for communities, for systems that work for them versus for just thinking about all the nuts and bolts and all the, the water quality data is showing me this, everything's showing me that. Listen to the community. What are they able to do? What funding do they have? If they need to have something that's very complicated and the electrician is a flight or away on a good day, right? Like up in Nunavut, then what are we talking about? Sometimes we can't get an electrician out for 4 or 5 days. That means there's no water for 4 to 5 days. They're on a boil water. So those are things we have to pay attention to.
No, I think you summed it up very nicely there. It's I think a lot of times we have the right solution, or we think we have the right solution, but we're not looking at the whole life cycle in terms of how this is going to be maintained. And
yeah,
it's not
the
that
best of intentions, really,
yeah.
right? But it's just we miss something in the delivery.
Yeah, no, very good. All right, we'll do one more question here. You mentioned having archaeological understanding for projects. Some bands do not like disclosing history or knowledge to outsiders. How do you work with them?
So in general, maybe I think it'd be worthwhile to talk to that community and ask them what they're comfortable sharing and what they're not comfortable sharing. If they're okay with just saying, okay, this is an archaeologically sensitive area. This is the areas we should be avoiding. And these are the processes we should go into when working into that area, whether they have a chance find process where, okay, if there's a chance find, they want you to call out their archaeologist or an elder to have a look at it. And they determine if you can actually remove the item or intern it somewhere else, or if they have another process in place. Usually if they don't want to share greater details, they might be willing to at least have you have a process in place for chance finds, or a process which helps you identify areas that you should be avoiding or areas that are more sensitive, so that you can at least do your design or route or site your infrastructure in a place that is less archaeologically sensitive to the community. And yet again, have the conversations and find out, why, not because you're trying to poke a hole into their way of thinking, but so you have a better understanding and have a way to work forward that meets the needs of the community and of the project, but at the same time, being respectful of their history and their culture.
Excellent. No, that's good advice. Excellent. Thank you very much. Okay, so I think that'll conclude the presentation today. I want to thank you very much, Freda, for being here today. Thanks for your time and putting this together, and lots of questions on the spot there. So well done. Thank you very much. All right. So again, moving forward, our last presentation of the year is in a couple of weeks here. And it'll be a presentation from Dr. Ian Moore from Queen's University, talking about some of the research work that they're doing there at the university. It's, I don't know specifically what the presentation is going to be about, but they do some really interesting stuff in terms of full scale testing of pipes, where, I mean, they're actually have these labs where they can move the ground and shear things, and it's not just by hand. They're having excavators and bobcats in there to lay the pipe. So it's they do some cool stuff there. So hopefully you can join us here on December 8th. There'll be some more information coming out. I think you go on the website, you can see the full extent of what that presentation will be about. And I think that's it. Yeah. And again,
People
thanks
can
for being here.
email me if they have any questions.
Excellent. All right, that concludes today. Thank you very much for being here, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.